Well, hello everyone. This is Fadi, and we have an amazing guest with us here in our Let Us Reason show. Of course, joining me here as a co-host, as always, is our brother Alex Blagojevic. And the guest that we have with us here today is no other than Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, who, of course, was the National Security Advisor for President Trump and served also as the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency known as DIA, and as the senior, of course, military intelligence officer in the Department of Defense. He also is the founder of the Flynn Intel Group, which is a commercial, government, and international consulting firm. And we are so honored, of course, to have you here with us, General.
Thank you so much, Alfado. I really appreciate it, and I always like being with my friend Alex.
Thank you so much. Well, of course, we want to, start by asking you if you can, just give our audience just a brief background about yourself, and obviously including your military career, whatever you feel comfortable sharing, obviously.
Sure. So I think for everybody that watches this show, I grew up in a relatively sort of lower middle class atmosphere. As a child, I'm one of 9. I have 9 brothers and sisters. My father was a World War II and Korean War veteran, so he was of that generation. My father retired from the Army as a sergeant in the Army years ago in the early 60s. And my mom, of course, thank God that she decided to have 9 children with him, right? So all of us are, and I have 2 of my siblings are here with me today. My sister Mary and my brother Joe. But so we grew up in a very tough family environment. Tough being, my father was one of these guys who would kick you in the rear end and tell you to go out and work. But he also taught us the golden rule to treat others like you like to be treated. And my mother was always about education and lifelong learning. So there was no, if you got bad grades in our house, you would be, you'd have to buckle down, otherwise you wouldn't be able to leave the house, right? I mean, my mother's a lifelong learner, and that's what she taught us. So those are sort of foundation elements of growing up, and there's many more stories, of course, that you can imagine in a large family growing up in a very small town in the state of Rhode Island. And I always knew from the time I was a young kid that I was going to go into the service. I didn't know that I would end up in the Army. I originally actually signed up to be a Marine, and it worked out where I ended up with an Army scholarship, kind of a fluke, and that's a long story. I actually described that in my book, The Field of Fight, how that came into being, and I graduated from an ROTC, a Reserve Officer Training Corps program out of my state university. I went to the University of Rhode Island, which is a state land grant university, and then rose up, almost 34 years of service. 5 of those years are in direct combat, facing and fighting our enemies overseas in different places, from places like in Central America or the Caribbean all the way over to the Middle East and Central Asia. I served in the military most of my career. For those that want to go look it up, or look up this place, is at a fort called Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I served there from the rank of 2nd lieutenant to brigadier general, so quite a few years. And Fort Bragg, North Carolina, is the home of the airborne and special forces for those that follow our military, particularly our Army. So it's a very disciplined base. It's a very very strong military oriented base, and a place where you have probably some of the finest men and women in our armed forces and our military that served there. So that was more than half of my career, and then the other half would be in different assignments. Some of them overseas, some of them, of course, in combat. Some of them in places like the Special Operations Community, where we would fight everywhere from East Africa to Central Asia, meaning mostly Afghanistan, and places around the world fighting the war on terror, right? Particularly in the last 15, 20 years. So I came out of the field. Really, I never served in Washington, D.C., and I think this is interesting for those that follow this kind of stuff. I never served in Washington, D.C. until I was a 2-star. So I basically stayed in operational assignments, or what we would call in the field, because that's where I felt most comfortable. I felt that was where I needed to be. And eventually, whatever catches up with you, and I was asked to report to the Pentagon, and I worked for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time, and I became the senior intelligence officer inside the Pentagon, working for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and that was as a 2-star. And that was my first assignment in Washington, D.C. So it's a long career to have without ever working in Washington, D.C. Most, I think, a lot of guys that make it to flag officer or general or admiral, you're in and out of the Pentagon in different respects during your career. And mine was a little bit different. My path was a little bit different. And then after that assignment, I went back to war. I went back to Afghanistan, and I served almost another year and a half in Afghanistan, pretty much 2009 to 2010 and into 2010 for quite a few months. And then I returned to Washington, D.C. after that assignment. And that's when I got into the Assistant Director of National Intelligence. And then I took over the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is sort of the military arm. For those that know the CIA, a lot of people don't know the DIA. It's the defense side of the intelligence arm of the government, and very large organization, great people. And the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, is one of the largest intelligence agencies in the world. It put me in the position of being the most senior military intelligence officer in the Department of Defense at the time for a couple of years. And that's where I kind of ran into headwinds, so to speak, right? With the administration of the Obama administration, where the message at the time after bin Laden was killed, the message was bin Laden's dead, Al-Qaeda's on the run. And I was asked publicly in open hearings with members of the House and members of the Senate, whether I believe that or not. And essentially I said, no, I don't. That's not what the intelligence, and that's not what we, with a lot of years of experience fighting these guys, believe. And as well as other things, I was really hard on China in terms of how we were analyzing the various threats that China faced, that we were facing from China. And so, that's my experience. That's my field. That's what I thought I was brought in to do, was to look at the greatest threats that we are facing. And those are two, right? Radical Islamists and China. Those are two. And it's funny, but they're aligned ideologically, because they are aligned against the United States of America. That's the ideological underpinning of why would those two ideologies align and want to take on the United States of America. So anyway, that's 5 minutes maybe in a nutshell. A lot of details that I'm leaving out. I had a great career. I'd go back and serve again in the military. The people that I served with were some of the finest men and women in America, not just in the armed forces.
Wonderful. Yes, very, very exciting. And today we're here to discuss The Field of Fight, and a book that was written in 2016, or at least
summer 2016.
Summer 2016. And I read the book, and I was looking forward to the interview. But I have to be honest, I thought that I would be a little disappointed by the book, because most of the books written on Islam and Fadi and myself are experts on Islam, and so most of the books are watered down books on Islam, and so I thought I would be a little disappointed, especially when it comes from a more of a political global strategy kind of thing. But I really was very pleasantly surprised, even though I have the highest respect for General Flynn. It's a book on Islam, radical Islam, and I didn't know what I was going to get, but I was pleasantly surprised. And it was an excellent book. So I'm going to go through, there are many ways we can go. I'm going to ask you a question. There are many questions I could ask you, and I know our time is limited. But first, I was going to ask you, but I'll tell the audience, so that, because it's not a major question, it's the title. I was wondering what the title was about, and it's The Field of Fight. And I was surprised also to find out that it's from ancient Greek epic poet Homer's Iliad. and that describes a battle between man and God. And I thought that was very interesting of a choice of a title. And I'm not going to ask you a question on that because there's many more important questions. But what I thought was interesting, and I knew when you described that the director of FBI testified that he was running investigations on ISIS in all 50 states, that there were cells everywhere in the United States of ISIS, and I knew that because I'd been involved with those kind of things. But with your experience and your boldness, I love the fact, and that's why you probably were hated, because you were calling a spade, and that's what I respect about you so much, General Flynn, and how you've been for the last 30 plus years fighting, and much of that time has been spent at top levels of U.S. military intelligence, so you know what's going on. But what I like first and foremost is when you said that we ought to know our enemy. You cannot fight an enemy that you don't know.
Right.
So you have to get in their minds. Now, for Al-Fadi, it's a little easier because he used to be a radical Muslim from Saudi Arabia, so he knows how radical Muslims think. For me, it was a little more difficult because it's foreign to me. I never thought in that matter, so I had to go back to the sources and try to understand what Islam was teaching at the core. But the first question I have for you is that yes, you have to understand your enemy. But what is really worrisome for me is that what's going on in our intelligence, what's going on, and you're talking about how people don't want to be facing and admit who our enemies are, and they don't want to describe them as who they are. So could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what has happened over time is this. You can say it's a desensitization. I mean, it's desensitizing our culture in the United States of America to call a spade a spade. It's desensitizing to say, well, look, this ideology is not so bad, and it's not about anti-Muslim. It's actually looking at a component within the ideology that is very, very radicalized, and to the point where they are what I would describe as true believers. So our culture really, after 9/11, for a short period of time, maybe being a few years, there was a sense of, we really did understand the enemy, and we were really going after the right enemy, and we were gonna defeat it. We weren't gonna allow this to happen again. But then as more people began to come into the government, and this is really, I would say, to use a military term, the infiltration of a culture of people, particularly during the Obama administration, that actually would have extraordinary levels of influence in our country to be able to shape policy, to be able to shape the messaging that we were then starting to have to repeat in government, and then of course repeat in our education system and repeat in society writ large. So I think that what we have to do, and one of the things that I always argued about, was you have to clearly define your enemy, because before you clearly define your enemy, you cannot defeat them. Because when you clearly define it, it's not to say, all Muslims are bad, all blacks are evil, all Irish are terrible, or all Irish are drunks, right? I mean, I'm Irish, right? So all Irish are drunks. So that's people say that, but that's not true, right? So there's aspects of the things when we are being desensitized. And now I'll tell you, that's a funny word for me to use right now, but I'm using it in a very precise way, because we have been desensitized clearly over the last 10 years, if not maybe even the last 15, where we've been desensitized to this idea of calling a spade a spade. And why have we been overseas for so long? We're overseas not to stand countries up, although that's what it turned into. We were overseas to fight an enemy that we were trying to ensure would not create bases and hubs to attack our country again, right? Or we were overseas to maybe learn and share the fact that we're not that bad, and to learn about the various cultures. So we know that there are Saudis or Moroccans or Libyans or Syrians or Iraqis, you name the Muslim world. Like in my book, I address Egypt, and I address the president of Egypt as somebody who stood up a little bit, and he gave a great speech, and he talked about what the problems are in the Muslim world, you know, and so I think that what we have to do, and what I talk about, is that, one, you got to define your enemy very clearly, and then you've got to decide how to defeat that enemy if you're going to fight them, if you're going to physically fight them. And now we moved from being physically engaged to the point of being, you know, where we had big forces over in Afghanistan or Iraq where we're actually conducting combat operations. We're now in this ideological engagement. And I feel like the culture shift in the country is actually moving away from what I describe in the book, The Field of Fight. And that shift is happening because there are influencers that are inside of the United States of America. They learn from our weaknesses, right? They clearly defined us. They clearly defined us as an enemy, right? As an enemy. And because, you know, if you study the different various variations of Islam, and you understand it to the degree that certainly you guys understand it. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I'm an expert on this, but I've studied it. I have spoken to my enemies. I mean, and had various discussions with them to learn more. And I find where we, you know, sort of 60,000 foot level, Al-Fadl, we can't solve all the problems of the world. What we have to do is we have to look at what problems we can solve. And the one thing that we can solve, and that's what I sort of big picture address in the book. If we don't decide that there is an element and there are ideologies that are against our way of life, clearly, communism, radical Islamism, fascism, I mean imperialism over time, if we don't clearly define those and understand that they are trying to attack our way of life, then we're always going to continue to have these problems. And as I've said many times, we're going to continue to find ourselves participating in war or participating in conflicts that just seem never ending. And we have to, you know, not only define it, but we have to push the burden to where it belongs. And that's why I address in the book, not only understanding our own foundations as a nation here in the United States of America, but also for the Muslim world, because I know that a lot of Muslim leaders read this book. I know that that Al-Sisi in Egypt read it, because I address what he says, and I address what ideas we talked about in the times that I was in the military, and I was going around talking to some of these world leaders, really. And my thing is that there is a need in the Muslim world for the Muslims to solve these problems, right? That's the real need. That's the real, and I think that if they do, and that means that some of these leaders are going to have to take a different path. They're going to have to stand up in a different leadership role, and they are going to have to work together. And it's not all about us, the West, or us, the rest of the world, taking from these societies. It's actually about giving these societies, not giving them things, but giving them the time and the room to be able to, you know, fix some of their own issues, right? I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book, and it's been a while, I talk about, you know, where did language get created? Where were books written about? And I talk about in I think it was whatever year it was, 2015 or 2014, where in Spain they had written more books than the entire Muslim world had written in 1,000 years. I mean, you know, stuff like that, right? I mean, so this was the seat of knowledge, right? That part of the world was it's where some great books came from, right? And books that still influence the world. So why all of a sudden did innovation stop? And why are things the way they are? And that's because there is an element in the societies that have shut down the ability for their people to be able to thrive. And that's a big statement. That's a very strong statement to tell kings and presidents and in some cases dictators what their problems are in their society. But I really believe that. I believe that if they allowed their societies to thrive differently, that they would find themselves as a seat of more international power rather than just a place where we're going to go fill up our gas tanks, right? And I use that in a pejorative sense, that last phrase about filling up the gas tanks, because when the American people, particularly America, when Americans think about the Middle East, they think about oil, right? So that's the whole reason why we're there. We're there to get oil. Well, if that's the reason, then that mindset needs to change. And the only people that are going to change that are the people in the Middle East. The people in America aren't going to change it, because maybe that's true. I don't think it is. I think that there's a lot of other things that can come out of there that are positive, good things for the world. But it's only if the leadership of these countries, of these nations, figure out how they want to operate. And I use the word thrive. I want them to thrive. And I want them to lead. And I want them to be part of the nation of nations. So when we talk about different things and we're able to accomplish them together, so that's out of one side of my mouth, and I'll get off my soapbox here. I'll follow in a second. One of the things I address in the book is the aberration of peace. I say that war is the norm in human history. War is the norm, and peace is the aberration, right? Peace is not normal. And people look at me when I say that in audiences around the United States. When I talk about that, they'll look at me like, "Oh, you're crazy." And I say, "Well, we've been at war for 20 years in this country. We just walked out of Afghanistan after the first 2 decades of this century. We've been fighting in Afghanistan. Now, maybe it's not tank-on-tank battles, but we've been fighting. People have been dying. The societies have been decayed because of the war. And the United States of America has been at it for 20 years. We still have forces in Iraq. We still have forces in other parts of Africa. So war is the norm for societies, for human history, and peace is the aberration." That's a sad testimony to human history. But that's how things take shape. And it doesn't mean that it's good or bad. That's just the reality. Maybe there's places where there's a sense of peace, but after a while, if you take it for granted, like I tell people today, Al-Fadl, about the United States of America, my generation, which is the generation after the World War II, greatest generation, right? My generation has taken our freedom for granted. And we are now in a place where our peace is at risk, right? Our peace for how we are as Americans, freedom-loving, being able to follow our Constitution, being able to follow our Bill of Rights, being able to follow our Declaration of Independence, and being able to follow our hearts, to do the things that we want to do to thrive. That is all at risk. And when that's at risk, that means that tension rises and uncertainty rises, and a sense of fear in a society rises. And I think that that's a dangerous element. Those are dangerous elements to interpose into a society. And that's happening to us. Everybody knows that. Everybody can feel that. Internationally, people that are paying attention to the United States of America know that. And particularly this idea that there is a sense of fear in the society here in this country. And because people are uncertain about what's happening and what's going on, and did this get stolen? Is this guy really the president? Or what about this policy? I mean, everything. And people begin to develop a level of uncertainty. And when you have uncertainty, then fear, the emotion of fear begins to rise, and then people take different actions. So, and we have to avoid that. What we want to do is we want to reimpose our freedoms. We want to refine or rediscover, probably a better way to say, we need to rediscover America for what it is. And in fact, I'll tell you, I always tell people, page 111 here is probably the most important paragraph that I spent. And I write this, I say on page 111, it's at the end of the chapter, and it's on the enemy alliance, right? And I write, "Let us not fear what we know to be true. Let us accept what we are founded upon, the United States of America, a Judeo-Christian ideology built on a moral set of rules and laws. Let us not fear, but instead fight those who want to impose Sharia law and their radical Islamist views." Because that's not the founding of our nation. That's not the founding of our republic. Our founders studied every religion known to man on the planet at that time, to include, all you got to do is read some of the diaries of the founding fathers, to include religions such as Zoroastrianism, which for anybody that's from Iran or Persia understands, Zoroastrianism is it's one of the oldest religions in the world, right, in the history of the world. And I've taken a look at that. And we had founders, I think it was Jefferson or Adams, they actually studied that. And they studied Islamism because they wanted to make sure that when they created when they founded this country and they created this country, they wanted to make sure that they weren't missing something. But what they decided to do is to say freedom of religion, freedom to be able to practice your faith, whatever it is. As long as you don't impose that in a harsh or unnecessary way against the will of the people, right? And get back to what I said about leadership in the Middle East, and what I think the leadership of the Middle East needs to do is that don't impose, expose, if you will, and get people involved in the lifeblood of your countries. And leaders, that's what good, positive, strong leaders do. They open things up, they open the eyes up, and all of a sudden people will, there's been really, really strong leaders in the history of the world, in that part of the world, who are some of the strongest leaders in known to man in the history of the world. And yeah, times were different, and they had their armies battling each other, but they were benevolent. At the end of the day, they were benevolent and they were good to their people. And I think that there are examples there are lessons that are positive and good that can be taken. And what you want to do is you want to leave behind those bad parts of those lessons that you can learn, and leave them behind, but learn from them. So anyway, that's a mouthful, but it's so important, this notion of who we are as an American society and what we were founded upon, and that we are a republic. We are a democracy, but we are a democracy that stands as a republic, meaning we elect our representatives and we allow them to decide what it is, how it is that we're going to live. When you begin to take for granted those people or those freedoms, then they will run away on you. These elected leaders, they'll become corrupt, right? And there's many, many examples in history, in human history, about republics that fell and collapsed, and they no longer exist. And so I always ask the question, I'll ask this audience, to answer it for yourself and to have the conversation in your homes. Is the United States of America waxing like the moon rises, or is it waning like the moon sets? Where are we in that transitory period of time of human history? And I want to believe that we're still rising, but we are at a very, very historic transition point. Now, how many years does it last, and are we able to shape it a little bit so we can maintain the freedoms that we all enjoy? All of that is at risk.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I'm so thankful for your insight, of course, and you come at it from various angles at a much deeper level than myself. But I'm like you, being a former Muslim with a jihadi mentality, and I appreciate the fact that you're saying you don't want to use a broad brush and just say all Muslims like that. Even say there are some Muslims who are disturbed by what the jihadis are doing. And my concern is that how can our intelligent officers, or at least most of our officials who are very intelligent people, overlook the ideology? It's an ideological battle. It is not just a group of people that you can defeat and somehow this whole thing will be put to rest. It's an ideology that's existed for 14 centuries, and it will continue to exist, and nothing is going to stop it.
It'll never go away, and I don't use the word never all that much, but this is an ideology. It's like Catholicism or evangelical ideologies in the faith-based communities, right? It's like communism or fascism or imperialism or you name it, ism. And so these are not, they're never going to go away. But what you have to do in this country to sort of speak for ourselves in the United States of America, we have to stick to what has worked for so long. And that means that we do have to accept the various, atheists, right? I know a guy that I talk to routinely who I know is an atheist, and we talk about it all the time, and we debate, but he's a friend of mine because he's got an analytic mind that is so strong, so powerful. And I cherish when he wants to talk to me about something, I cherish his analysis about whatever the issue is. And he's an atheist, right? I don't like disavow him. I don't think any, in fact, I like the guy. He's a friend of mine. So, and it's like Muslims. I have very, very good friends who are Muslims, very good friends. And because they offer, and particularly in the United States, they offer a not only shrewdness in the business world or in the military world, but they also allow a conversation to be had that's more legitimate. It's like this conversation that we're having right now. I do think that what has happened is there is and I say this. I think I already used the word infiltration. There is an infiltration, and it is enabled. It's enabled by a political class in this country that allows this infiltration to occur inside of the fabric of our government. So that's one point, one aspect of it. The other is that it's also an acceptance, and then it's sort of you're going to direct elements of our government that you must do the following things, right? You must adhere to these rules. You must teach this thing, right? And it's almost like you're forcibly telling me that I have to accept something that I know is just, when I look at it for myself, right, with my own free will, and I study it, I'm like, wait a second, this is not what our country is based on. It is not what what is right? It's not. It's this sense that this is not. Why are you forcing me to have to examine something just because you're acting as though let's like what everything, and I'm sort of alluding to everything going on with critical race theory and the Black Lives Matter, but also it's the same thing with the sort of, particularly in the military, some of the chain teaching that was going on to basically say, no, you must accept this. You have to accept this. And I'm thinking, wait a second, why do I got to accept it? I mean, and why are you forcing? It's like I tell people, I don't wear my religion on my sleeve because I'm not going to sit here and tell my buddy Alex that I'm not going to say, oh, you need to be a Catholic. No, and this is the way, and I'm not going to start preaching to him because you get sick of it. I get tired of it sometimes when people come to me and they're showing their religion so much where you kind of get, you're pushing it on me. Don't push it on me. Religion is a very sensitive issue, and health is a very sensitive issue, right? My health conditions, about how healthy I am. Your financial situation is a very sensitive issue. So yet in our government, we find our government in some aspects, particularly in different administrations, and this would be one of them right now, it's like you're forced to accept it. And whenever you force somebody to do anything, it never turns out well. It doesn't turn out good. And it's unnecessary. You shouldn't have to be forced to like something. You should like it because it actually is a good thing, right? And so you meet people. It's like I tell people a lot, be careful when you're asked for money from an entity or a thing. Go find out who are running these things. Go see the person. Go meet the individual. Look at what's inside of them. Look at what's in their heart. Look at their actions. Look at their words. And we're way imperfect. I mean, I know. It's like, as much as I've talked about different things, I know I've said some things that were probably inappropriate, and it's not. I mean, yeah. So if I did, then I apologize. I mean, we're all sort of sinners and we're imperfect, but that's not the point. The point is that don't force this on me, and we tend to do that in our government with certain aspects of ideologies, particularly right now. This is happening, and it's trying to disrupt the fabric of a free society for people who are free-thinking people. But they're able to do it because our generation has allowed ourselves to take for granted the role of the federal government, and the role of the federal government has almost flipped around on its head, where the federal government under our Constitution, under our founders, they didn't really give the federal government all that much to do. They really didn't. They gave individuals a lot to do. They gave states rights a lot. They gave us a lot for states to do. They didn't give the federal government that much to do. And yet in the sort of the experience of America over a couple of hundred years plus, that whole thing has been flipped on its head. And now we have a federal government that's able to impose far more conditions on our lives than we ever wanted as a nation. And people are starting to feel it, and everybody is starting to wake up to it. And now we realize, oh my God, we've taken for granted our freedoms. And so now what do we do about it? And that's, now we, like I like to say, local action has a national impact. You got to get involved in your communities, but you got to understand your community. You got to understand the communities that you're in. And the demographics in this country have shifted tremendously. The demographics have shifted since 1950, and then 2010 was another census, and then they just did another one. And they're trying to, the federal government and federal authorities, through the political system that we have, they're trying to change the landscape of the country, not to our benefit, not to the benefit of the Constitution, but away from the benefit of the Constitution.
Well, one of my biggest concerns, General Flynn, is the PC culture, and you talk about that in your book. And but
political correctness.
But political correctness, yes, and the hypocrisy, or even just people, and the fact that it even infiltrated our intelligence. You call it the politicization of intelligence, right. And it really concerns me, because one of the attacks I get, the number one question I get from people, when I speak publicly, is why do you hate Muslims? That's the number one question I get.
Yeah.
And I tell people, why do you think I hate Muslims? I love Muslims. If I criticize communism, does that mean that I hate most of my family who lived in Yugoslavia? I have a right as a citizen to criticize any ideology I want.
Right.
Whether I'm right or wrong is a different story.
Right.
But I have a right, and so this PC culture that's infiltrated the West is that if somehow you criticize any ideologies, that somehow you're a hater,
you're
racist,
or whatever,
you're Islamophobe,
right.
You're vile, you called, those.
Well, those are names. So that's important. That's just super important, because we're talking about the use of words to denigrate, right? And these very strong ideologies that are very center-based, meaning they're based at where the top leads, right? Not the people lead, right? The top leads. They're center-based, and so the use of words to denigrate and to demean and to box you into being whatever the names are. I mean, I don't even want to use them. But it's you said that, to use a phrase. I mean, and I'll take it from loving Muslims to saying I love people. I'm generally, I love people. I mean, I'm a people type of person. I love engaging people, and frankly, and part of that loving people is also trust. And like I learned to say many years ago, that I will give trust away because I generally get it back. And once it's violated, then you don't make that mistake again with that person or with that element or whatever it was that you were dealing with, because those are two components of emotions and values, trust and love, that we have to have as humans. And this is not a touchy-feely session we're having here. This is about people. And so I'm going to trust somebody until they prove themselves otherwise. I'm going to generally like these people that I meet or see in the various groups or the various, in my military days, working with many, many different countries, working with many societies, many ideologies, many different ways to function and operate and believe, and going to different events with people that were events that were not Irish Catholic events, right, so to speak, right? So, what we have to do is we have to trust each other, and we have to generally like people until they do something that causes us to say, well, this is not right. This is not right. And that's where you get these very strong ideologies that are center-based, meaning that they're top-led and they're dictated downward. They're not from the bottom up. and they're essentially told what to do. And what they're doing, Al-Fadl, is they're imposing themselves on you. And what they have convinced, in some cases, leaders in our country, what they have convinced them, and frankly, I don't think it took a lot of convincing. I think it actually, they were already there. But what they have been able to do is they've been able to convince our leaders to impose these things on us, right? Those of us that just want to get along with people, right? Work together, treat others like you like to be treated, the golden rule, and just be a good person, right? Be a good person. But we get imposed by these quote unquote these leaders in our country who say, no, you're a bad guy because you have a bumper sticker on the back of your car that just so happens to be a replica of your state flag, and you're from one of these states that still carries the Confederate component of the flag on the state flag. So now what they want to do is they want to change the state flag. Or if you have that bumper sticker on your car, they want you to remove it because it's like, wait a second, this is a free country. I can put out. And this is not to say anything about what people believe or don't believe. This is to say that we have an imposition and a theft of our rights and our freedoms being had today like we've never seen in our country before. And everything that we're talking about with all this stuff that I do describe in this book, The Field of Fight, everything that I'm talking about is actually, it's like I wrote this book from 2015 to 2016. It was published in 2016. But if you read it today, you'll go, oh my God, this is still going on. And then actually with this current situation that we're in, the situation is actually growing worse. It's actually getting worse because they don't follow the idea that we just have to work things out, and let's not be politically correct, right? Let's call a spade, to use Alex's phrase at the beginning. I mentioned earlier today to a group, Al-Fadl, about the emperor has no clothes, the story which you teach children about. The emperor has no clothes. The emperor goes down into the village and he's riding a horse and he's got no clothes on. And he rides through the village and everybody's kind of snickering until the little child at the end of the path finally says, hey, king, hey, emperor, you're not wearing anything. And he suddenly looks at himself and he's embarrassed because nobody wants to say what needs to be said. Okay, and it takes a child in this story to say it. And I learned that as a child. I learned that story as a child. And I think now as I tell about it, 60 years later, that I think the reason why I learned that as a child, or the reason I was taught it as a child, was because if you have something to say it, and say it professionally, say it politely, say it maybe to the side. Like if I the best way to counsel somebody is not to chew their rear end out in front of the group, but you pull them away and you say, hey, let me tell you something that you're doing wrong. You got to fix this, and I don't want to embarrass you, right? And you can and we can do that as well. But now what we're being told is if I say something, I'm called all kinds of names. Alex is called all kinds of names. You're called all kinds of names. And the media in our country just picks up on it and carries it as though that's who you are. And then some number of people, some percentage of people, they believe it. They believe that, that you're a racist, right? That I'm an Islamophobe. And that's as far from the truth as we can get.
Yeah, and it's the whole idea of tolerance is that I tolerate you even though I don't agree with you. That's right. The whole idea of tolerance. Right. And yet, the people who supposedly are the most tolerant people are actually in reality the most intolerant people because they want to impose their ideas on us and they don't want us to be able to voice our opinions. So thank you, John Flynn. I know you have to go to your next thing.
Going to meet a bunch of veterans here. Yes. Al-Fadl, it's great to see you. Thank you, my friend.
Great to see you too. Thank you so much. We would love to have you again to continue this discussion. We recommend to people, of course, to buy this amazing book. It's a New York Times bestseller called The Field of Fight: How We Can Win the Global War Against Radical Islam and Its Allies. And I encourage everyone to really get a hold of it. It's a small book, easy read, but it's succinct, straight to the point. And, General Flynn, you are a commodity these days because, like you said, you remind me of that child who points out the obvious that everybody else pretends that it doesn't exist.
And by the way,
Thank you for
General
saying
Flynn,
that.
when he was a general, people who were below him, he always respected the ones, not who kissed up to him, but the one who came in with respect and told him the truth. He wanted the truth. And so in the same manner, he respects people who speak the truth, because that's what, our freedom is, and we have to protect it.
And those people will always be attacked. They will always be attacked. So for those people that watch this show, Al-Fadl, that are part of your subscribership or your audience, I mean, you know who you are out there, because you're like saying, yes, that's right. I always try to tell that at work or in my family or in our situation. It actually takes energy. It burns energy to be a mean person or to lie, right? I mean, what you have to do, if you tell the truth, if you expose things, it's actually easy and it's uplifting. It's spiritually uplifting. Talk about, a sense of elation when you actually get out there and you say, boy, I finally said it. There it is. It's on the tip. Now, people, if they don't like you, that's fine. That's what happens. And because they can't handle that sometimes. So anyway, thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for your service. And especially that you served in the Marines. They're a special group in my heart. My son served in the Marines. So
I served in the Army. I originally was enlisting in the Marine Corps. And that's why. And I've served with the Marines a lot in my career, and I love the Marines.
Well, thank you for your service. Thank you so much.
We have 15 copies signed by General Flynn, so we'll give them away to viewers. Yeah.
Alex, thank you so much. General, thank you, and hope to see you again. Everyone, hope you've enjoyed this show, and I'm sure you've learned a lot from the wisdom that was shared here. Blessings to all of you. Take care.
God bless.